Okay, let's get going. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Fathom webinar. We are doing a number of webinars around our different data sets and some of the projects we're doing with our partners. Before I get into the webinar, just a few housekeeping rules, if you wouldn't mind keeping yourselves muted. We will be having a Q&A session later on. Please use the Q&A panel in your interface to record any questions, and we'll get onto those at the end of the call. Okay, so what I'd like to do is firstly introduce myself and my co-presenter. My name's Gavin Lewis. I'm the head of engineering here at Fathom. We're based here in the UK, and we are going to talk to you today about a number of different things around our US data, but particularly one of the projects we've recently completed with partners of ours called AquaStrategies. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Barney, who's the president and CEO of AquaStrategies and who was the key instigator of this project. We're going to talk about a number of different items today. I'll talk a little bit about Fathom and a bit of backgrounds to who we are and what we do. I'll be touching on one of our core data sets, our US flood maps that we provide to our range of different clients, and how we compare to FEMA data. I'll then be handing over to Barney to talk about the case study on the Texas Water Development Project we've recently completed. I'll be wrapping up with a brief summary, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. Okay, before I get any further, what I'd like to do is launch a very quick poll with everyone. And we'd just like to get your thoughts on some of the key issues you might be faced with flood mapping. We've got a couple of suggestions there, but if you have any other ones, please complete them and fill them in. Well, I'll leave that up for a little bit, and we'll be effectively, I'll be presenting the results towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so Fathom, we're based in the UK, and we're formed out of the University of Bristol Flood Research Team. Andy and Chris, the two founders of the business, were doing their PhDs in flood mapping and felt that they could do much better by creating flood maps based on the research that they were actually doing, and set up Fathom with a view to provide really a detailed and comprehensive view of water risk intelligence at a global scale. And because of their academic background and scientific pedigree, really the whole business has been set up, has been underpinned by the science. And it's a key differentiator for us, and continues to be so to this day. We publish all our methodologies and validations of all our data sets and models in peer-reviewed journals, leading scientific journals rather, and all those papers are available on our website. We make them open to anyone. We think that's really important to be transparent around our methods and methodologies and comparisons of data sets, because it really instills confidence with our partners and our end users and our clients, because they can get a really good understanding of our data, how it works, and share that with their key stakeholders as well. And that's really important for us. And ultimately, we continue to drive the boundaries of science in relation to flooding. It's a very effectively, it's quite juvenile in our understanding, and there's a lot more scope for scientific research and development, and we're constantly applying that research to the models and the data sets that we create. Okay, so effectively, what do? We create computational flood models. And what does that mean? We pull together a whole range of big data sets, and we create that produces computationally, and that produces a number of different outputs that could be flood hazard maps at a global, country, or city scale. We have recently developed a global terrain data set called Fathom, 30 meter resolution, for the whole globe. And through the work that we've done with our clients in the insurance industry, we have developed CAT models for the UK and the US. So it's not just providing an understanding of risk and hazard through our hazard maps, but it's also taking that information and really looking to give a financial impact analysis, so understanding the cost and the impact of flooding for insurance companies and various asset owners. We also do quite a bit of event response for the UK government and for countries in the third world that are hit by flooding events and tropical cyclones, and it's it's a key part of what we do. So what I'd like to talk to you about really is our US data set, Fathom US 2. This is a data set that we produced and launched 2 years ago. It's at 10-meter resolution. It covers the whole of the US, and effectively we provide it for 2 hazard layers for pluvial fluvial flooding. We've got coastal flooding being built into a new model that's coming out later on this year. It's essentially for the current climate state, and as part of that data set, we cover 10 return periods. So from very high frequency events, the 1 in 5, the 1 in 10 year events, right the way up to the 1 in 1,000. And we have 100% of the river channels are represented in the data. Okay, so we produce the data, and one of the things that we're very conscious of is that obviously FEMA is the gold standard in the US, and obviously has been around for a long, long time. And we knew that when we produced our data that we would quite fairly get challenged around how our data compares to FEMA. And so we set about working on this, and we went through an exercise and produced a paper, as you can see here, and we can share the link to that paper with you around that we partnered with Google on and compared our data to FEMA data, and where we matched to a very great extent with FEMA had the data, but we're also able to identify areas that we could also provide additional insight on flooding. Now, as many people know, the FEMA data is very comprehensive. However, there is quite a lot of area of the US that is not mapped. We believe about 40% is not covered by FEMA. And the data that is captured, quite a large proportion of that is quite old and not necessarily up to date, and doesn't necessarily represent the latest perspective of flooding. And because of that, when we brought our 2 data sets together, we were able to identify quite a significant difference in the level of data and the impact of flooding that was identified. You can see here for this 1 in 100 year event that the FEMA data has been captured and really represents the major river channels and a few tributaries, whereas the FEMA data captures that, but also a lot of the headwaters and a whole range of flow channels in addition to the FEMA data. Now, taking this information, we wanted to put that into context. So we worked with the Environment Protection Agency and used the government population data in a paper we partnered with the EPA on. And we took FEMA data and our data and the population data and combined them, and to get a perspective of the exposure of population in relation to each data set. With the FEMA data set, it was about 13 million US citizens were exposed to flooding. With our data set, it's threefold. That's 43 million people were exposed. So we can see the differences in the data, and that comprehensive, consistent view of flooding across the US does produce some quite startling results. If we project that forward towards the end of the century, that is a staggering 75 million people that are impacted by flooding based on our data. Now, that's not taken into consideration climate change, which is obviously going to have an impact. This is just due to urbanization. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavor of the data we have and puts it into context for you. What I'd like to do now is hand over to my co-presenter, Barney Austin of AquaStrategies, to talk you through the project that we jointly did with Barney and team for the Texas Water Development Board. Barney, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I appreciate it. Great introduction. Let me first say,
Barney, you're on mute, I think.
I shouldn't be. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Holly says I'm not on mute and she can hear me. Okay, I'm going to keep speaking, Gavin. Holly says she can hear me.
Okay, well, everyone else says they can hear you. It's just me. Okay.
So yeah, let me just say a few words about AquaStrategies first and how we first met the Fathom folks. I was working on a project with the University of Texas, and the Fathom folks came to Austin, Texas to describe the Fathom model, and I thought there was a great opportunity there to work with Fathom on something interesting, something neat in the United States. And at the time, we just experienced Hurricane Harvey, and that was a really big deal for Texas. In fact, we'd had some pretty significant flooding for the last 3 years. And so it seemed to be there was a great opportunity to work with Fathom somewhere. And I spoke with the Texas Water Development Board folks about the Fathom product and the new planning initiative they'd begun. And this project was born. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my presentation. But first, let me tell you a little bit about AquaStrategies. We're a small water resources engineering firm based out of Austin. We do a lot of numerical modeling. In fact, we usually do the type of numerical modeling that the larger engineering firms perhaps shy away from, more of the specialized type stuff. And so we're a logical partner for Fathom on this project that I'm going to talk about right now. Next slide, please, Gavin. This is going to be a challenge. I'm going to put my finger up, Gavin, for next slide. So Hurricane Harvey, let me talk about that real quick because, you know, like previous slide, please, you know, significant droughts and water supply planning, sometimes it takes a major event for changes in legislation or, you know, major funding initiatives to come about. And in our case in Texas, there has been infrastructure funding for flood projects and legislation directing the Water Development Board to help with flood mitigation strategies and flood planning. But with Hurricane Harvey, that caused $190 billion worth of damage to the Houston area, which was more than Hurricane Katrina, by the way. You know, that really was a wake-up call for Texas and a call to action for the legislature and others to do something to take a more proactive role, for the state to take a more proactive role in flood planning and flood mitigation. That hurricane event, by the way, caused or resulted in over 50 inches of rainfall in parts of Texas just outside of Houston, which is a new continental record for the US, which is also interesting. So in 2017, I think it was, Senate Bill 8 passed, and what that called for was some additional flood planning led by the Texas Water Development Board in Texas, a more statewide approach. But first, Texas is very good at water supply planning, and in particular, taking a regional approach to water supply planning. We have a bottom-up approach that began with Senate Bill 1 in 1997, where the state is divided up into regions, and each of these 16 regions develops their own water supply plans that are rolled up into a state water plan. It's a very grassroots approach that has been highly commended, and we feel very successful in Texas. So the state decided that perhaps a similar approach for flood planning, where there's so many different entities and organizations responsible for planning for flood, whether it's flood mitigation or flood forecasting, bringing those folks together to develop a statewide approach would be a good approach here in Texas. But that first step of the process was to reach out to stakeholders, all those folks, key stakeholders who have some responsibility related to flooding, bring those folks together in these town hall meetings to discuss what they think could be improved on state flooding and flood preparedness. And they produced this report. I was involved with this. Half associates were the ones directing this project, contracted with the Water Development Board. But there was a number of recommendations. Some of them are obvious, some of them perhaps not so obvious, but you know, that first recommendation, and I'm paraphrasing these here, but risks, impacts, and mitigation costs really haven't been assessed on the statewide level yet, and really need to be. So that gets to that coordination role. A lot of Texas is unmapped for floodplains. Rainfall statistics need to be updated, and that's happened, of course, with Atlas 14. But the other recommendation, Texas needs a strategic plan to deal with floodplain mapping and mitigation. Sound science and data needed, of course, and a significant amount of funding needed to help reduce the impact of future floods in the future, and just flood mitigation. Next slide, Gavin. So the Water Development Board, of course, already has flood programs, as I mentioned. Senate Bill 8 passed in 2019, not 2017, but also provided hundreds of millions of dollars in financial assistance to help communities that did not have the financial wherewithal to do flood planning, flood mapping, or flood mitigation. It's modeled, this new flood program is modeled on the regional flood planning process, water supply planning process, like I mentioned. The state in this case is divided up into 15 regions rather than the 16 regions for water supply planning. And the basin delineation, those region delineations follow watersheds as you'd expect for a surface water activity. And these regional flood planning groups are represented by key stakeholders. So those who have an interest and responsibility and good knowledge on flood-related activities in those regions. And those regional flood planning groups are supported by consultants. So the responsibilities, and similar to the water supply planning role that the Water Development Board fulfills on flood planning, the Water Development Board lists out a bunch of key roles and a bunch of deliverables for each of these flood planning groups to help ensure consistency and that information needs are met, and that a flood plan, when it's rolled up into a single plan for the state of Texas, is consistent across those regions and addresses all of those needs and interests. But they're directed to look at the risk specific to each of those regions, and more specific to that, who is at risk within each of those regions, what the impact of flooding is, including not just residential areas, but critical infrastructure. And then probably most importantly, or certainly most interestingly for a lot of folks, how do you reduce that risk? So what mitigation strategies can be implemented in order to reduce risk, and how do they prioritize across those regions? Next slide, Gavin. So let me talk a little bit about the Fathom model and why in particular in Texas it was particularly useful. I think Gavin mentioned that much of the US is unmapped from a FEMA floodplain perspective, and in Texas that's true as well, with about 63% of the state being unmapped here. Now the state has been proactive since Senate Bill 8 in funding the development of base level engineering maps for those gaps, and have dedicated something like $45 million to do that, have hired half a dozen engineering firms to work on those maps. But as you all know, that's a lengthy process, and it's not something that can be done over the next few weeks or months even. That's something that's going to happen over the next few years. But those regional plans, as dictated by the legislature, are due on January 2023. And I think that deadline's being pushed just a little bit, and some additional tasks given to the regional flood planning groups. But nevertheless, that schedule is not consistent with the schedule for development of the BLEs. That first state plan is due in September 2024, and the Water Development Board is going to be rolling up those regional plans into a state plan. And so there's an obvious need in this situation for a Fathom model to help fill those gaps, help provide information about floodplain extent in areas that we don't have any information. Okay, next slide. So let me talk about the Fathom model and in particular its application to Texas. Gavin, next slide, please. So the Fathom model is a 2D model, as Gavin mentioned. It's applied, we've already applied it at a 30-meter scale across the entire continental United States. In fact, the model's been applied all over the world already. But for particular applications, we rerun the model and bring in local information, better information at the local scale when it's available. You know, there are other models similar to the Fathom model that have been applied elsewhere and probably in the United States. This is the only peer-reviewed one that has its results compared to the FEMA results and is at least being described in published literature. Next slide, please. And we have, as Gavin mentioned, several papers out there that you can download and view. We can send those to you if you'd like. Next slide, please, Gavin. So let's talk more about the Fathom model. So there's actually 3 components to it. There's a pluvial, fluvial, and coastal aspect to it. And of course, flooding happens at the local scale, at the fluvial scale, and from storm surge. The pluvial piece uses what should be familiar to most of you, a rain on mesh methodology. We do build in the new Atlas 14 rainfall statistics into that. And the pluvial component is used for watersheds that are less than 50 square kilometers. So catchment areas that are less than 50 square kilometers. And that allows the model to reach further up into the tributaries than you typically have available with those FEMA products. The fluvial piece uses regional flood frequency analysis. So we're using stream gauge statistics for that. It's a subgrid hydrodynamic model for drainage areas. There's a typo on this slide, but it's for drainage areas larger than 50 square kilometers. And we build in other features. This is where we get to the local data. We build in features like levees and dams into that, where we have that information and the areas that those flood mitigation structures help protect. The coastal piece is also based on tide statistics. So we look at tides, tide surges, and waves. So all 3 of those things are built in. That information we did for Texas. That's not available across the entire country. We did that for Texas, though. And so those 3 pieces, those 3 individual model components are develop 3 different data sets, and we combine those data sets by just selecting whichever model produces the largest depth of water for that particular pixel or that particular part of the state. Next slide, Gavin. So, and this is described in at least one paper, but in probably elsewhere as well. But the results that we produce when compared to the FEMA floodplain maps do contain some additional information that may be useful just for some folks. Some folks are just interested in what happens when major rivers are flooding, but often it's what's going on in those smaller tributaries, but also the depth of water is important, which isn't always available. So when we run the Fathom model, on those major rivers, the extent of the 100-year and 500-year floodplain maps is very similar to what the FEMA models produce, the HEC-RAS models produce. But like I said, there's some additional detail there that's useful. And going further up the tributaries, there's some more information there that shows some additional vulnerabilities. When we run this model, particularly for areas that are not mapped, it's information obviously people didn't previously have, but it's also super interesting to look at areas that have been mapped and compare the Fathom results to the previously modeled areas to see where there are differences and why there are differences in that. So as mentioned in those statistics by Gavin, there's a large portion of the state even that does have floodplain maps that are missed by the conventional approach. Gavin, next slide, please. Next slide, Gavin. I apologize for this little technical snafu. Hopefully we'll get it resolved here before the presentation is finished. There we go. So specific to Texas again, what we did here is, well, let me back up just a little bit. Texas is probably not unique, but is interesting in that we have LiDAR data for the entire state at a pretty high resolution. But those LiDAR tiles are all, or a lot of them are at different resolutions, have been collected at different points in time. And somewhat frustratingly, a lot of them are presented or made available in different projections as well. So the first step in this process was to gather all of that LiDAR data across the entire state and make sure we had a consistent resolution, consistent format, consistent projection, and make sure there weren't any gaps between tiles in that LiDAR data set. Turns out there were some gaps that we were able to fill, but that output, that final output for the LiDAR data was at 3 meters. So we now have a data set at 3 meters resolution for LiDAR data across the entire state, which in itself was a pretty good data product for the Water Development Board. But the contract that we set up, again, through half associates with the Water Development Board, was to output statewide flood depths for pluvial, fluvial, and coastal events over 4 desired return periods. And we selected 5, 10, or they selected, the Water Development Board selected 5, 10, 100, and 500 year events. Next slide, please, Gavin. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about that digital LiDAR data set. Next slide. So this is what when we back up just a little bit, the key to the Fathom model is really good topography. And the Fathom model, the reason it is able to work on the scale that it works and run, although Fathom has this huge cluster of CPUs at Bristol in the UK at their head office to run the model, it runs much more quickly and efficiently than a HEC-RAS model would on this kind of scale, in part because they've simplified the physics for the shallow water equations, right? So we're not inverting a huge matrix to solve the shallow water equations for this. But in order for it to work effectively, we need good topography. And Texas having LiDAR data across the entire state makes the model run that much more effectively than it would run otherwise. So in Texas, there are 33,000 tiles of LiDAR data from 35 different LiDAR missions flown between 2006 and 2019. So it was a 13-year effort to collect all of that LiDAR data. And working with the Fathom folks, we corrected those overlaps. So where you got more than one LiDAR data set, which is the best one to use. So we looked at that, fixed the projection and resolution. So we had a consistent resolution, and then filled gaps between tiles by looking at other data sources such as USGS topo sheets. Fortunately, those gaps were very small, but we still needed to fill those gaps in order to run the model. Next slide, please. Gavin, next slide. So I'm going to skip over this here pretty quickly, but yeah, reprojection, prioritization, how do we choose the best LiDAR data set, gap filling using the USGS NED, and in tile creation. The final product that we used to run the Fathom model and we developed and delivered to the Water Development Board was 93 tiles, 1 degree by 1 degree. And that data set's 320 gigabytes. So yeah, that wasn't a deliverable that we emailed them. Next slide, please. Next slide, Gavin. So this is what that data set looked like. So in addition to the LiDAR data, other data sets that we needed, historical stream flow. Of course, the USGS is fortunate, or sorry, Texas and the United States is fortunate to have a large number of stream gauges, mostly probably operated by the USGS. And so we use that for developing the extreme flood events as input for the Fathom model. We also have great tide gauge data set run by NOAA. Texas funds, certainly funded in the past, and I think still funds the Ticoon tide gauges across the coast of Texas, and we use that to feed the coastal storm surge piece of the Fathom model. And then rainfall, of course, comes from the Atlas 14 data set. And that image that you see on the slide there shows the differences between the precipitation data set that was used previously and Atlas 14. Next slide, Gavin. Okay, so let's talk about the deliverables. But before I get into the deliverables, let me talk about the process for getting a contract with the Water Development Board and getting started. You know, rightly so, probably the Water Development Board was a little bit skeptical that we could run a model for the entire state of Texas when they were going to spend $45 million on doing BLEs for the entire state. So we chose a Huck 8, a small watershed in the lower part of the Brazos, as a proof of concept. And we ran the model for that particular Huck 8 and presented those results. And then the Water Development Board compared the recently developed BLEs for that watershed with the Fathom results. And that proved or provided them enough comfort that it would be worthwhile doing the entire state of Texas. But they also had another concern, and that was our ability to produce those model results in a timely fashion. And they really needed these gaps to be filled to be able to provide that information to the regional flood planning groups in a timescale of about 6 months. So it was a really tight timescale. And of course, they didn't want to have to go back to the legislature to request additional funds, so they had to do this within their existing budget. And they also didn't want to go through an RFQ process, again, which can be quite time consuming at the state level. And wouldn't probably be consistent with their 6-month time frame. So they used an existing contract with Half Associates, and we enjoyed a good relationship with Half Associates in managing this products and being able to deliver to the Water Development Board. Next slide, Gavin. So in addition to the data set, we produced a large number of memos. The Water Development Board wanted to know how we processed the data, how we were doing spot checks to QA/QC the results, some information sheets that they could provide to the regional flood planning groups to describe what the data set was and wasn't. We actually produced some videos as well, some 15-minute very high level and some more detailed 45-minute videos on how the model works. How we incorporate dams and levees into the model, and then just as importantly, criteria for use. So where do we use the Fathom model? Where is it recommended to use the Fathom model, and where would you use other products? We produced and delivered to the Water Development Board depth rasters at 5, 10, 100, and 500-year return periods, and of course this LiDAR DEM as well. Next slide, Gavin. So what? So hopefully at this point you're not thinking, well, that's not very impressive. But I wanted to talk about, you know, why this was important for Texas, why this was so well received. And, you know, we developed all of this on budget, on schedule, per the details of the contract. We filled in the gaps in what they call the quilt, the floodplain quilt for Texas. And the quilt describes all of the different floodplain products that are available with some sort of hierarchy. So where the Fathom model fits into the quilt provides the regional flood planning groups with great information to fill their gaps. You know, we produced all of that on time. Another kind of useful thing that the Fathom dataset provides is information for the Water Development Board to help them QA/QC the BLE products that they're getting from those engineering firms. And looking at the Fathom dataset next to the BLEs at least allow them to compare two independently developed data sets, and where there are differences, just to dive a little bit deeper there and figure out why there might be differences there. And then, of course, that corrected data set. Next slide, Gavin. Okay, so we're talking with the Water Development Board now and other stakeholders and potential clients across the US about other products that the Fathom model might produce, or other things that we might be able to do with the existing data set. And one of the things that garnered a lot of interest is being able to rerun the model at different frequencies. So what does a 1 in 5-year event look like? What does a 1 in 75-year event or a 1 in 1,000-year event look like? And now that we have the model available, rerunning those different frequencies is fairly easy to do. And interestingly as well, there's a lot of interest in those lower frequency events, the 1 in 10-year, the 1 in 5-year events, which the HEC-RAS models don't typically perform very well. But the Fathom model has a channel solver in there that does produce better results at that lower frequency. Next slide. Another interesting thing we're looking at is the possibility of developing or assisting in flood forecasting. So doing developing a flood forecasting model where the actual flow, the CFS at a point in time and a point geographically in the future is one thing, but knowing what inundation is likely going to occur due to that peak flow is also very important. In fact, it may be more important, and that's certainly what the emergency management folks are looking to. They want to know which streets, which areas, which facilities are going to flood in the future. That translating that CFS number into something like a floodplain map is important to them. And if you run the Fathom model at different frequencies corresponding to different flow rates within the watershed, you can develop sort of lookup tables or lookup maps, if you like, that helps that flood forecasting process and helps emergency management folks with that. So that's something we're discussing as well. Next slide, Gavin. Another thing we've discussed and discussed with Fathom and are talking with clients about is a dam break analysis. So what happens if some sort of flood retention structure breaks? This is something that is important to folks. Emergency managers want to know about that. We've done a very simple analysis with the Fathom model, assuming catastrophic failure, so sort of an instantaneous failure of a dam and what happens downstream. But we could develop variations of that, associated perhaps with an earth embankment reservoir where that dam failure is slightly slower, or a partial failure, things like that. If you know the hydrograph downstream, then we can develop the associated floodplain map. And the Fathom folks have done simulations for about 100 dams across the US already, but that's something that we could use the Fathom model for as well. Next slide. So the other thing that's of interest to lots of folks is what happens with changes in the watershed, whether it's urbanization or flood mitigation, or impact of flood mitigation structures in the watershed. So you can run different scenarios fairly easily for the entire watershed with the Fathom model once it's already being built. So those basin-wide simulations. Another sort of related thing that I think Gavin talked about earlier is impacts of climate change. Some people argue that Atlas 14 came about because of climate change that we're already seeing it, and that may be the case, but you can run different precipitation and hydrologic scenarios through the Fathom model fairly easily to look at those. And we've discussed, in fact, in my conversations with clients, that's the most interested, that's what folks are the most interested in. So running climate change scenarios through the Fathom model. Next slide. And lastly, of course, Texas is not unique. Many Texans would argue with that, but Texas is not unique in not having floodplain maps for the entire state. It does now, of course, but there's lots of other states that don't have floodplain maps. And so, you know, there's lots of other opportunities elsewhere in the country, and we're speaking with some of those states already about possible application of Fathom and developing a model that uses that local information. But yeah, if you're interested in talking with Fathom and AquaStrategies about how this could be applied in your state to solve your particular challenges, then we're looking forward to meeting you next week, or just reach out by email. I'm going to hand off to Gavin now, who's going to wrap up, and look forward to speaking with you soon in the Q&A.
Hi, Barney. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope you can. And thank you, Barney, for managing with the technical problems we've had just on our side, because I couldn't hear him at all. Anyway, let's go through a bit of a summary here. So one of the things that we want to talk about really is around our data and how it's applicable to if you're involved in managing floods, if you're a modeler or planning. We believe our data could be applicable to you because of its consistent nature for the fluvial flooding. We know it complements FEMA data, but we can provide the data at a national scale or state, county or city level, depending on your area of interest. We provide it in that GIS ready format. And if you would like to know more or request some sample data, please go to the link at the bottom of the page here on our website, fathom.global/ASFPM. So that's our current view of flooding in the US. We, as I alluded to earlier, we're in the process of totally rebuilding our US flood model, and that'll be released later on this year. And it will include not only fluvial, but also coastal flooding. And that's sea level rise, storm surge, but also we're taking into consideration tropical cyclone or hurricanes in the case of the US, and the excess or increased rainfall or precipitation for the flooding, the inland flooding elements as well. So we're building all that into the model. And that's for the current climate state, but we're also developing that for future climate states as well. Okay, so it's inland and coastal flooding for today's perspective, but future climate states. Now, the way we're doing that is because of the work we've already done in the UK and Japan around climate change and flooding. We have different organizations who want to use our data for different RCPs, different time horizons. So we're effectively making this scenario agnostic, which we're developing the data to have a framework that we can actually pull out any RCP or SSP and timescale that you require to satisfy your particular requirements, because you could have different requirements, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or a local governmental perspective or a commercial perspective. You might want to have different views of the impact of climate change on flood risk of your assets. The image here I'm showing is an image of Houston, and you can see in the blue area, that's for the 1 in 100 year event, that's the 2020 perspective, and you can see the additional areas shaded in red, that's the 2050 perspective of flooding. So you can see there's quite a significant difference. So we'll be building this into our models. So we're going to be in Florida in a couple of weeks' time at the ASFPM conference, and if you're there, we'd love to see you. Please stop by and have a chat, and we'd love to find out sort of what you do in the flooding arena and how you could use our data. We're on stand 802, and it'd be great to have a chat to you at the conference. Now, if you can't make the conference, because I'm sure there's quite a few people on the call today that potentially can't do that, and you would like to know more, as I mentioned, here's the link to our landing page on the website, and please fill in the details, and we'll come back to you if you would like more information around the data, some sample data, pricing and licensing, how you can get hold of it, but also we'll share some of the technical papers that we have as well. Right, let's move on to the Q&A session. Now, we've got quite a few questions that have come in, which is great. I will read these out to and see if there are any particular ones that Barney would like to answer. So let's have a look. Any plan for Fathom model or limited version to be available for public download test? We don't make our data available. Obviously, we're a commercial organization, but we are happy to provide sample data to interested organizations if they want to test and evaluate our data, and that's something that we do on a regular basis. Some of the other questions we've got, one of the questions, I think one for you, Barney, around combining pluvial fluvial coastal flooding. I wonder if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so there's three modules in the Fathom model, and so the pluvial, fluvial, and coastal all run when the model runs itself, and those are three different data sets that are produced. And then the process for developing the floodplain map is a fairly simple one. We just choose whichever model produced the greatest depth. And so sometimes there's overlap, as you can expect, with the fluvial and the coastal especially. But we just choose whichever depth is greatest, and that works well. I should have mentioned in my presentation as well that we filter out depths that are less than 6 inches. And that, I think that's a fairly sensible and standard process because of the pluvial piece where you've got very heavy rainfall. That water sometimes takes a little bit of time to get into the defined channels. And so we wanted to remove that from the data set.
Thank you, Barney. We've had another question around our data and the validation of our data against FEMA. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this has been covered quite a lot in our scientific papers, and in the email that we'll send out, we'll put the links into the papers so you can look at the validation, and specifically the critical success index measures that we provided in the data. Okay, let's have a look at, we've got one here. Can you discuss your thoughts on the implications these tools and products will have on flood risk management process? For example, will the industry have a high-level model for planning risk scenario planning, then more local detailed models to support design and detailed planning? And how will these two models be leveraged, coordinated to reduce flood risk?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that, Gavin. Okay. In Texas, I mentioned very briefly in my presentation the floodplain quilt, and that essentially what that is a hierarchy of flood products, floodplain mapping products, from the very localized models that are being developed, typically typically around cities and things like that, large urban areas. Very detailed studies that are right at the top of the hierarchy. And then near the bottom of the hierarchy are, digitized paper floodplain maps that were developed a long time ago. The Fathom model fills the gaps and will likely replace some of those older or outdated products as well. But for any particular location that you have, at least for planning purposes in Texas, there is, a preferred or recommended product to use. Now, what I didn't mention in my presentation is the Fathom model is not FEMA approved or FEMA endorsed. It's not going to be used for insurance purposes, but it is a great product to use for planning purposes and prioritization of areas that are vulnerable within each of those regional planning groups. So I think there's lots of things that we can do with the Fathom model. It's very interesting for a number of reasons. Hopefully you feel the same way, but it's not going to be a replacement of the HEC-RAS approach, at least not anytime soon.
Okay, thank you, Barney. Got another question here. Regarding flood defences, are you officially sourcing information or remote sensing estimates? And and are there plans for providing uncertainty related to the part of the data? I think certainly answer the first piece. For the US model we did, there were obviously public data sets from the US Corps of Engineers and various other sources, although we spent a significant amount of time with some resources on the ground looking at local data and pulling in data at a sort of a city and a county level from a whole range of local sources that aren't available nationally. We built them into the model, we reran the model and validated against those new defences, which made a difference. One of the key parameters in obviously the flood model is ensuring we update the flood defences when that data becomes available. So it's not only what's made available publicly, but we've developed a particular algorithm for LiDAR data that will detect flood levees and categorise them, and we can build that into our flood model. And we're doing that on our current flood data set. We published a paper on that algorithm about using the LiDAR algorithm for defence detection, and we can share that with you as well. Barney, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about the flood defence side of things.
Yeah, we had some interesting discussions about that in Texas specifically, and how to incorporate levees. And what we decided for at least for West Texas along the Rio Grande Valley is to incorporate the levees that are certified, but to not incorporate the levees that weren't certified. And that's actually another interesting thing that you could do with the Fathom model, right? You could run, assuming these levees are certified, and see what difference they made, or take out those levees and see what impact that would have. And being able to rerun the model over a large geographic area to test those different scenarios, I think could be pretty interesting. But for Texas, we assumed that certified levees were in the model and doing their job, whereas the levees that aren't certified were not explicitly built into the model, except to the extent that the LiDAR data sees them to be in place.
Thank you, Barney. We've got another question here. Can users export Fathom model results to other computer programs like ArcGIS? So the data, the hazard data maps in GeoTIFF format, which again can be consumed by any GIS platform for analysis. And then you could obviously do your own point and polygon querying to develop that and do much more deeper analysis around that within your ArcGIS or GIS platform. So a lot of our clients use it in that format. Barney, did you have any other questions that you wanted to pick up on?
There's a whole bunch of questions and some really good ones. I'm trying to type answers to some of them. I know Holly's typing some answers and you have as well. And I don't know if we can leave this Q&A up here for a little bit longer afterwards. Hopefully some of you will be in Orlando in a couple of weeks and can come visit us at our booth, and we can help answer those questions face to face. Let's see if there's any other. There's a question here. How will you take advantage of new FEMA BLE data as it's rolled out? And I think from my perspective, I think I'm kind of curious to see how the BLE data compares to the Fathom data in those areas that are currently unmapped. And I don't know that there'll necessarily be updates, but it will, I think, give folks a lot more comfort that the Fathom data product is actually very good and very comparable to the BLE data, maybe better than the BLE data, possibly. But certainly, I think a lot of people will be comparing those two data sets as they become available for these unmapped areas.
Thanks, Barney. Another question that we've had is, can we speak briefly to known gaps, shortcomings that you're aware of? What are the terms of improving the model? Yeah, like any model that's produced, it's only as good as the input data and the methodologies. One of the key things for us to improve any model is one, the terrain data. We were very fortunate with the Texas project because they'd recently completed capture of pretty much the entire state with new LiDAR data, we were able to ingest. So that makes obviously a significant difference, where we can ingest new LiDAR data. Other information would be defences, as we mentioned earlier, in areas that we map globally, particularly developing countries where data on defence is scarce or next to nothing. We have to make certain assumptions and model those defences. So again, if we can have greater certainty about river defences, then that's better. And then things like channel bathymetry obviously makes a difference, and we can build that into our models. So there's a number of different parameters, and as I mentioned earlier, talking to or working with our core science team of scientists, we appreciate that the science that they're researching now is still embryonic. It's fairly juvenile compared to other perils like windstorm and earthquake that have had 20 or 30 years of intense modeling, particularly from the insurance sector. And there's much better understanding of how these hazards are developed. And so, there's still a lot more to do, but like anything, it's, we're always on the lookout for more improvements in our data. And we do have a release cycle, probably about 18 months on our data sets, partly because there's no point just pushing a new release out if there's no improvement. We're only going to do that if there is new terrain data, new defense data, or we've made a significant step forward in some of the science and the method of the methodologies that we've developed. We've recently launched a channel solver, which looks at more in-channel flow and has much greater efficacy for fluvial as well as pluvial events, particularly for smaller channels. And for those being able, this really allows us to have confidence in the higher frequency events, the 1 in 5, the 1 in 10, and then 1 in 20-year events. Those events that obviously are more regular and a bit painful, but not as extreme as the larger events. Barney, anything else that catches your eye there?
Yeah, there's some great questions here, and I'm not going to be able to answer all of them online. I think several of the questions are highly technical in nature, and I think they've been answered in some of your publications, Gavin, some of the peer-reviewed papers. I think what we need to do is just produce a list of those papers that we can make available either by email to the folks that attended the conference or just bring that list of papers to the booth in Orlando, so folks can pick that up and they can download those papers themselves and read about the technical questions they have.
Absolutely, I think we'll take these questions away and we'll work on them, and we'll come back to those people that have asked them, because we haven't got the time, unfortunately, to get into that technical level. We're happy to set up specific one-to-one calls if you want to discuss our data and modeling in much more detail, and we can get some of our scientists and the model developers onto the call to satisfy those queries. I'm just conscious of the time now, and we are sort of kind of running out of time. Was there any other questions, Barney, that caught your eye at all?
Yeah, I think there's one question here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it, but it is an interesting question. Which regions does the model perform better? Does it perform better in mountainous areas or in plains area? I think he means sort of steep or flat areas. And, I think the model just performs well where we've got good input data, like every model, right? So if we've got good topography, whether it's steep or it's flat, we've got good precipitation statistics, and we've got good stream gauge data, a long historical time series of stream gauge data, the model is going to perform really well. Where those pieces of information are somewhat lacking, if we're having to if we have pretty crude topography or not very good precipitation or stream gauge information, the model is not going to do very well. But that's true for every model that you might apply to those areas. So I think that's the way to answer that question.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone that sent us questions, some of which are very detailed. we will respond to them individually via email. And so we'll follow up with you on a one-to-one basis on that effect. But we're just drawing to a close now. I'd just like to let you know there are various sources of information. We are, for the ASF PM event, we are putting a particularly attractive pricing offer together for floodplain managers if they want to license our data for the first year or 3 years. If you want to know more, please come and visit us at the stand or drop us an email. And you've got the links there to book a meeting with myself, my colleagues, or access to the scientific papers. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd also like to thank Barney, not only for doing some really good slides and talking in depth about the Texas project, but also keeping cool under pressure when my sound died, and we were able to keep going. So thank you very much for that, Barney. Let me just hand over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, so looking forward to seeing many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you in the next couple of weeks in Orlando. There's contact details there. Feel free to reach out to Gavin. I think my email address is in there somewhere as well, but it's just baustin@aquastrategies.com. We'll try to provide via email or some other source a list of those papers for you to follow up and find out, but feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any technical questions that are burning a hole in your pocket, so to speak. But thanks for your attention. As I see, there's 60 some people that participated, which is awesome, and look forward to meeting many of you real soon.
Great. Thank you, Barney, and thank you everyone for attending, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.